Hello all, welcome to our talk about Korea in the post-classical period. So we're still in period 3 here in AP World History. So first off, geography-wise, Korea is a peninsula that's located very close to, well, it borders China, and it's very close to Siberia and Russia. It's also very close to Japan, which is very important because in terms of culture and language, there are many similarities between Korean and Japanese culture, so we'll discuss those. Uh, so it's important for us to realize that these cultures interact with one another pretty constantly during this period. In terms of trade, they're more interested in trading locally than they are with the large scale transcontinental trade networks. Although, of course, with the presence of the Silk Road, there is an ability to get items from farther away, but ultimately we find that there's much contact between all these different places. And arguably, the Korean culture is much more in tune with the Chinese just because they actually share a border. But again, as time goes on, we will see that the Japanese also interact quite frequently with Korean. The Korean language has developed somewhat independently from Chinese and Japanese, although we will see that there is some syncretism once these cultures start to interact more frequently with one another. In terms of the relationship with China, Korea was essentially a tribute state during the Tang Dynasty. The Korean dynasty, which we'll elaborate on soon, the largest one was the Silla dynasty, which we can see located here in eastern Korea. And the Tang dynasty demanded that any representatives from the Silla kingdom visiting China would have to perform the ritual kowtow ceremony, which we've discussed before, but just as a reminder, this is a tradition where visitors to the emperor bow so that their head touches the ground. And then, in addition to the kowtow, Silla ends up paying tribute to China in exchange for the traditional benefits, things like military protection, trade privileges. So Korea ultimately is somewhat dependent on China at this period. The Korean kingdom ultimately agreed to perform kowtow and agreed to pay tribute because they wanted to appease the Chinese. They figured that the alternative might be some military aggression, which they didn't want. But again, giving tribute to China did have its benefits. So Korea began receiving valuable Chinese exports, which it may not have had access to otherwise. In terms of similarities to China, now again, the Koreans were in pretty close contact with the Chinese because of their tributary relationship and also just because they shared a border. So Korea actually emulated many aspects of China's politics and culture. The capital of Korea, Kumsong, was modeled after the city Chang'an. We could compare that to the Japanese capital at the time, Nara. Now, I did not have any good photographs of Kumsong since it really has changed quite a bit. It's much more of a modern city now. But just in terms of location, Kumsong is located here in the Silla Kingdom in present-day South Korea. They had a centralized government in the same style as the Chinese, and Koreans also adapted both Confucian and Buddhist beliefs over time. And the educated elite in Korea studied the Confucian classics, but the peasant classes were much more attracted to the Buddhist doctrine. Not surprising, of course, because of the emphasis of equality in Buddhism. The Koreans also adopt a writing system that is somewhat adapted from Chinese, but the adaptation is very awkward because the Chinese and Korean spoken languages are structurally very different. So they share many words, but to actually speak those languages is it's not the same as, let's say, if you speak a Romance language, you oftentimes can recognize another Romance language. Like if you speak French and Spanish, for example, it's not that simple. So I wanted to show you just some examples of different East Asian texts. Korean is often recognizable because there are many circles that are used in their writing, or round shapes. This is Japanese and this is Chinese, so we can see that the Japanese characters oftentimes are very similar, I would argue, to the Chinese characters. Note, let's say, this character here and this character here. There's a similar structure. So actually, one could say that in terms of written language, the modern kanji writing of the Japanese actually resembles the Mandarin Chinese character system much more than the Korean character system does. So the Koreans actually, keeping on the subject of language, they adapt an alphabet in the year 1446 CE, so that's very close to the end of period 3. And the alphabet actually is syllabic, which is very different from the traditional Chinese character system, which, if you remember, each character represents a word or a potentially some other sort of representation, but the Chinese character system is much more complex than the Korean alphabet system. The Koreans have 14 different consonants and 10 different vowels, and the idea is that because of the syllabic alphabet, that Korea is somewhat easier to learn than something like Mandarin Chinese. And there was a saying that a wise man can acquaint himself with them before the morning is over. A stupid man can learn them in the space of 10 days. So, in general, the idea is that even a stupid man, not the best choice of words in my opinion, but even a stupid man can learn Korean fairly quickly. All right, so just visualizing again. So every vowel that we see in Korean has a circular shape associated with it. That's how you can tell the difference. Again, another word in addition to syllabic that you should know is phonetic, although this is spelled wrong, silly me. Phonetic has an E after the O here. So I like to say that phonetic is not actually, the word phonetic is not phonetic. Anyway, silly joke. And Hangul ultimately is seen as almost a scientific form of writing because they are emulating the shape that your mouth makes in order to make the sound of the vowel. Pretty cool, actually. In terms of the Korean bureaucracy, the landed aristocracy actually had more power in Korea than it did in China. So the Korean elite actually was able to prevent certain Chinese reforms from ever being implemented. In other words, you can see that this is also a feudal system of sorts, right, where the nobility holds the true power. And there was a civil service exam in Korea, but it was not open to the peasants. So in reality, it was not a merit-based system, right? It was ultimately one that already had many exclusions. So even though the Chinese civil service exam did influence the Korean civil service exam, it by no means could be seen as a meritocracy. So one could say that they're sort of going away from Confucian traditions there in order to appease the position that the nobility is already in. In terms of Korean art, I see many similarities, at least to Chinese. We often still have much emphasis on nature, particularly on this painting that we see on the right. There oftentimes also is calligraphy, and in this instance, we see that poetry oftentimes is actually written on artistic works. Also, many times the artist will include his signature, which is this red stamp signal here that we see. And some of the images we could see are a little bit more distinct, I would say more unique, particularly this image here. Definitely something that we did not see in Japanese or Chinese art previously. So, of course, there are some adaptations over time. In terms of Korean dance and music, we see that there are multiple different styles. The court dance and music style is more formal. Court, just like Japanese court, like Chinese court, is very elaborate. There's a certain code of conduct, a certain etiquette, and a certain expectation for dress. And so court dance and music is seen as a form of entertainment to the wealthiest people. Whereas folk dance and music is a little bit less formal. You can see that the costumes, particularly the ones you see represented down here, are less elaborate. And folk dance was something that could be enjoyed by many more social classes. This was more of a, as the term folk suggests, this is something that the common people were much more open to, and they probably actually saw. In terms of Korean art and ceramics, jade tended to be the medium of choice. So jade you can recognize as this pale green. This was something that was incredibly valuable, something that still fetches a pretty penny if one wants to buy an item that's made out of jade. And this pattern of jade that's pretty common, this inlay that we see, was introduced in the 10th century during what's called the Goryeo dynasty, and it's still something that we see fairly frequently in Korean ceramics, and we also see quite a bit of it in other parts of Southeast Asian society. This is another slide that demonstrates different styles of Korean dress. Definitely a more formal style that we see in these two images here, a little bit less formal in these images here, and of course some of these are coming from film, so there might be some romanticization taking place. In terms of food, we do see that there are some unique types of Korean dishes and also things that are influenced from outside countries. And so what we see oftentimes, and this is somewhat reminiscent of Chinese style, rice tends to be the most staple food. And then there's a main dish and multiple side dishes. So ultimately, when you sit down for a traditional Korean meal, you tend to share your food with everyone else at your table. A lot of times you'll see many different types of dishes in the center of the table, and ultimately everyone helps themselves. The more unique Korean dish, it's essentially the signature dish of Korean cuisine, is kimchi, which is it's a vegetable that's actually pickled and it's fermented, so it contains ultimately alcohol because of the fermentation process. It can be spicy or not. And it's very, very common in Korean cuisine, and in my opinion, it's delicious. We also see often other ingredients that are very commonly used in cooking, and again, there are many parallels. The use of soy sauce, soybean paste, hot pepper paste, sesame oil, and vegetables is also something that we see in many Chinese items of cuisine, and also I've seen quite a bit of it in Vietnamese and Thai cuisine as well. Oh, and so this is a good example again of multiple types of vegetables that are served together. In terms of religion, I just want to preface this by explaining that this is a more modern depiction of the religions in Korea. Christianity was not something that was prominent in Korea during period 3 in AP World. Okay, so let's be sure that we are familiar with that. Buddhism was the religion that tended to come from China into Korea. And ultimately, what we see is that Christianity is going to spread to Korea during the missionary era, which was much more common in the 18th and 19th and early 20th century. Also, more traditional religions are rooted in shamanism. So shamanism is more of a folk style worship. It's an ancient style worship. It contains elements of offerings to the gods. So one could see it as more polytheistic as well. Ultimately, we can see that this is a more shamanistic practice. These people are giving up offerings to their gods and lighting candles and praying directly to them. Oftentimes, participants of shamanism actually seek advice or seek help from the gods. So that's one of the reasons why they give the offering, is because they're hoping to receive some assistance in return. This is a ritual shamanistic worshiping practice. The shamans also wear specific costumes, and this is something that is actually, this image here is more of a tourist attraction, people who want to see what more ancient shamanistic practices were like. As I said earlier, Buddhism is going to become a more popular religion because the Korean people are often trading and interacting with the Chinese. And so it actually is introduced fairly early on in Korea, 372-ish CE, and it ultimately becomes a state religion as Korea becomes more of a dynastic empire. Buddhism influences almost every element of Korean life. It shows up in the arts, like we see a Buddha represented here inside of this temple. And the current population of Buddhist people in Korea is about 24%, which is significant because we just saw on this previous slide here that there are also many Christians, and as we just said, there weren't very many Christians, if any, back in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th centuries CE. So the fact that there are so many Buddhists still in Korea is significant. And also they celebrate the Buddha's birthday every year in Korea. Confucianism is also a belief, not so much a religion, that influences Korean society. So during the Joseon dynasty, there was an active encouragement of Confucian philosophies. And they also, of course, as we said earlier, they adopt the civil service exam, although it's less inclusive. But Korean Confucianism is complex and it's very unique, but ultimately they do get many of their ideas from the Chinese. And it says it's quasi-religious here, which is important. I know go back and forth in class and on these videos about what Confucianism truly is. Is it a belief system or is it a religion? Well, on the one hand, it's important for us to realize that Confucius is not worshipped as a deity, but the fact that his beliefs are written down in the Analects and they're passed from generation to generation, and that they shape the way of life of societies that believe in Confucius. That sort of suggests that it is somewhat of a religion just because it is also a way of life. And it also, of course, helps structure different traditions, different economic and political structures in Korea. And then, as I said earlier, Korea also eventually is exposed to more Christianity, mainly from a missionary perspective. So it actually first came from China. So one of the reasons why that is because there was a lot of missionary activity in China first. At first, Catholics were not welcome in Korea. We see that many of them were actually executed, essentially as heretics. Eventually, they are canonized in the 1980s, partly because now Christianity is actively practiced in Korea. By the early 20th century, you see Protestant missionaries directly traveling to Korea. Part of that is because at that point in Korean history, they were ruled by the Japanese. And the Protestant missionaries attempted to bring improvements to Korea to make their missionary efforts more successful. In urban areas, such as, let's say, the South Korean capital of Seoul, Christianity is much more common. And that is it for our talk about Korea. We're going to move on to Vietnam in just a moment, so stay tuned and thanks.